Welcome back. We'll continue this discussion. Pandey Sahab, if I can come back to you. Now that we have a sense, say that the armed forces, in this case the Navy, going back to the mid-90s, the late 90s, actually had in place the equivalent of a 30-year plan as far as the induction of submarines are concerned. 14 years down the road, we are saying that we were not able to advance or take the plan forward in the appropriate manner. What would you ascribe this to? I mean, what are the constraints that the system faces?
Well, first of all, I think most plans are drawn up without reference to, they're drawn up as ideal plans. They're not drawn up with reference to the existing constraints in the environment, both in terms of finances as well as in terms of time, as well as in terms of, procurement systems and the need to observe transparency in all systems, etc. And unfortunately, the services not having this interface with the environment themselves cannot build in those constraints. And this requires a kind of teamwork. This requires that the priorities are set together where the civil bureaucracy provides the inputs which are necessary for people to plan better. So I think this should be a combined, should always be a combined exercise. It cannot be an exercise which is done by the services in isolation from the ministry, then handed over to the ministry and then expect the ministry to implement that plan, because that plan may not be implementable. So I think problems arise because of this peculiar architecture where the kind of consultation or the kind of interaction which should take place at every stage does not take place.
So which means greater integration between the civil and the military side, which most people say.
Yes, greater integration, but integration, I don't know how it works out in practice, but certainly greater consultation, greater interaction, much more sort of peer interaction.
Let me just push you a little bit on this, mainly because it's not often that we have a civil servant with your experience, particularly in the MOD, to reflect on these issues. What would you identify as your success stories? Meaning that in your tenure in the MOD, which I remember in the early 90s, we did have, I would say, certain significant quote-unquote achievements on the procurement side. So would you like to just recall, identify how you did it?
Yeah, well, I think partly it was a question of attitudes. I thought that I was a service provider to a client, and I treated the army, which was my main thing, as my client. And I said it is my business to satisfy my client system. And therefore, I developed a relationship of great equality and of great we really function as a team.
As a team, yeah.
And in the process, what I was talking earlier, the priorities that we set for ourselves were completely agreed on. They knew how much money we had, what other additional ways in which we could generate resources by selling surplus stores. And this was a time of acute, probably the biggest financial crisis we were faced.
At that time, the early 90s, yeah?
Early 90s, we were facing a foreign exchange crisis of enormous proportions. We were facing the breakup of the Soviet Union, the transition of the Soviet Union from that, our dependence on the Soviet Union for equipment, our Soviet debt. I mean, it was a combination of enormous problems.
Factors then.
So in that problem, we had to modernize. We had to modernize it. We had to work as a team. Otherwise, there was nothing that could happen. B, it was fortunate that the main actors got along famously with
We're all in sync.
We're all in sync, and including defense finance. And once you get the support of the finance man, then you can really achieve wonders.
Anup, just to extend this, I do remember Amitabh, when he was in the MOD, I was tangentially involved. He used to be identified as a man who could get things done, particularly on the civilian side. You may not have known of this, Amitabh. But for the Navy, considering that the last 10 years have been pretty significant. It's not as if the Navy has not acquired major platforms. For instance, whether it was the Jal Ashwa or the Maritime Reconnaissance Aircraft, the P-8I, or the INS Chakra, which we have got on lease, and the biggest platform, the aircraft carrier. I mean, these are all actual tangibles that have been delivered by the same system.
That's right.
So what I want you to really ponder over and perhaps explain to the viewers is that when we talk about the inter-se prioritization, I mean, I'm sure that for the common person, this is a reasonable question to ask, saying that when we are agonizing about submarines, how come you managed to get the other platforms? So how do you sort of explain this particular imbalance?
First of all, I think Mr. Pandey has hit the nail on the head on both the counts, not just 2 counts, but on both the counts, where problems actually lead to voids and trust deficits. 1, he spoke of attitudes. 2, he said that he considered himself as a service provider, but actually both are providers. Why can't both become an integrated whole, as the group of ministers had recommended after the Kargil Review Committee report? It would have been such a wonderful thing. But I must point out here that a great achievement was made in the MOD when one step towards integration was achieved and is doing very well in the Defence Procurement Board. However, the story is not complete till you integrate the MOD, as they call it, main. That means the entire home section of the Ministry of Defence. You've got to give each of the actors there their due. The Joint Secretary, he has a skeletal staff, and below him there are again senior level, middle level people like directors and deputy secretaries, just 1 or 2 in each of the Joint Secretary's office. For example, the Joint Secretary Navy, he has just 1 director and 1 deputy secretary, two desk officers, 1 or 2 under secretaries. How do you expect them to match up and be equal to an entire planning staff in the service headquarters? And their time is at a premium. Therefore, there is protracted file shuffling between the service headquarters and them. And the most important thing is that expertise as well as details and operational requirements reside in service headquarters. So if you integrate the MOD main, which has been a crying need for many decades, and actually it was accepted by the group of ministers' recommendation, I think 50% of the battle will be won. Now coming to the point of how did we achieve so many other procurements? Actually, the Navy is not done too badly.
Absolutely. I mean, the Navy is done well in terms of major inductions.
Yes. But one also needs to remember that there was what I have called, when I was Director Naval Plans, a dark decade which started in the late 80s, if you'll recall. There were such severe austerity measures imposed because the government had run out of money. There was hardly any foreign exchange in 89-90. And that process continued right up to about 96-97. It is only after that that the Talwar class had to be quickly inducted straight from Russia. Why? We had an aim in the 50s set up as an objective and a mission statement by our ancestors in white uniform, that the Indian Navy, despite having missed the Industrial Revolution, will be a builder's Navy. Yet we went for import option, because a naval platform, unlike any other platform, cannot be picked up off the shelf. It has a long gestation period. Now the dark decade of nearly 10 years meant a cascading effect, which is being experienced not only in the submarines but even in surface ships. Why we have done so well insofar as surface ships are concerned is because the 3 defense shipyards, and now the 4th one, HSL, has been included, have been doing a wonderful job despite the fact that there are problems of modernization of build technology amongst the employees. They're all government servants, and you know what happens in PSUs. But one of the things that has, where a lot has been achieved is in surface ship inductions from abroad. That means the Gorshkov, which is Vikramaditya, the 2 tankers, and the follow-ons of the Talwar class. In India, we still have to cross that threshold where we will come to some stage which is parallel to, or at least comparable to the West or to the Koreans or to the Chinese in building warships within 48 to 60 months and not 120 months.
Let me get Amitabh here. The 2 points that he made. One is to say that the integration, the fact that the Joint Secretary in any of the departments of the MOD, Navy, Army, Ordnance, etc., is always under pressure. You know, my own recall is that they are either firefighting when Parliament is in session or they are under enormous overload. But despite the fact that there have been so many suggestions about the integration and trying to get the military or the armed forces into MOD, it has not worked really. Now we are in transition. there'll be a new government in place, and national security is going to be a very, very critical part of the responsibility for the new team. Do you think any progress can be made in small ways, about your experience when you were there, what Anup is saying, that how do we progress the integration?
Well, I'm really not very clear on how integration actually takes place. What I would focus much more is on devolution. I really think that extraordinary amount of powers need to be devolved from the ministry to the services, from the chief down to the court, down to the smallest possible unit of decision making. Massive delegation is required, and we need to move to the whole concept of responsibility centers, budget in that manner,
activity, yeah.
And have budget holders who exercise full powers. And you have to trust. At the moment, our entire system is based on distrust.
Lack of trust.
Lack of trust. Unless we move to a thing that a group of people is capable of taking the right decision, and we trust them to take them, and we empower them to take the right decision.
Again,
so I think that empowerment is
the critical part. If you could briefly touch upon the second point that Anup mentioned, which is that the Ministry of Defence is dependent on what you might call as the defence production units across the board, Army, Navy, Air Force. We know that many of the delays that we speak about are also ascribed to what you might call as the output and the culture that is endemic to the entire public sector as a spectrum. How do you think we should address that?
I have very radical views on this, and I don't think it will be found very acceptable. But I really don't think there's any rationale anymore for the existence of the Department of Defence Production as a separate department, as a separate empire, for the existence of Department of Defence Research. The DGQ, I mean, you have the most ridiculously unwieldy white elephants of these investments. And these are huge, capital guzzling, lumpy investments which are a drag,
and
such a phenomenal drag. You need to sell off these, make a customer-friendly industry,
in the
take
private
the lead
sector.
role in the private sector, which should, and we should move to make and buy decisions rather than buy decisions, or rather than ancillarization at the moment
minor
of
things.
those minor things.
These are big issues. For instance, over the last 10 years, the government had set up two major task forces. One which is referred to as the Ramarao Committee report, which looks at the DRDO, the Defence Research and Development Organization, and the other is the Kelkar Committee report that has looked at the potential for the private sector to enter into the defence market. Again, for a variety of reasons, these have not been put in the public domain in the appropriate manner, nor have we had any movement. And again, it comes back to the central issue with which we had opened this discussion, which is the nature of civil-military relations. Now, I often say that civil-military is not just about the political leadership, the bureaucracy and the armed forces. It's also about India's civil society, which includes not only the private sector but academia. The dissonance needs to be addressed. These are complex issues, and hopefully we'll come back to them. Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you, Anup. These are complex subjects, but I hope that we have informed the viewers to some extent. Keep watching. We will be back on Friday with another subject.